Welcome to Nikki's Nightmares, where chilling tales come to life. In today's terrifying story, we descend into the forbidden history of demonic possession and exorcism, ancient rituals born from fear, faith, and the belief that something dark can invade the human soul. From whispered prayers and violent manifestations to real cases that inspired some of the most disturbing horror films ever made, this is a journey into rituals meant to confront forces that refuse to stay buried, and the people who paid the price. If you love scary stories, paranormal encounters, and true horror experiences, you're in the right place. Make sure to like, subscribe, and join me as we delve into the deep, dark, and the mysterious. A brief, terrifying history of exorcisms. Exorcism is one of humanity's oldest defenses against the unseen, a ritual born from fear, faith, and the belief that something dark can take root inside the living. For thousands of years across cultures and civilizations, people have believed that evil does not always lurk outside the body. Sometimes it moves in, and when it does, exorcism becomes the last line of defense. Long before dimly lit churches and Latin prayers, versions of these rituals existed in pagan traditions and Jewish customs. Different words, different symbols, but the same purpose: to force something unnatural back into the shadows where it belonged. The Catholic Church would eventually formalize exorcism into solemn rites, prayers meant to confront something ancient and malevolent, a battle between light and darkness played out within the human soul. For many modern audiences, the idea of exorcism is inseparable from one cultural moment: the release of The Exorcist in 1973, a film so disturbing it permanently altered how the world viewed possession. But what the movie showed, spinning heads and violent convulsions, was only the surface of a much deeper history. In reality, exorcism is defined as a prayer or ritual intended to remove the influence of a demonic or evil power over a person. And belief in those powers has never disappeared. In fact, reports suggest demand for exorcisms has increased since the turn of the century. Christianity, especially Catholicism, is most commonly associated with the practice, partly because the Gospels describe Jesus himself casting out spirits. These moments weren't just miracles, they were demonstrations of authority, proof that he held power over something dark. The earliest written account appears in the Gospel of Mark, believed to have been written around AD 70, roughly 40 years after Jesus' death. These stories didn't just describe possession of people, but even animals, establishing a terrifying idea early on, that evil could move freely and choose its host. As Christianity spread, so did these beliefs, and in the 16th century, exorcism found itself at the center of religious conflict. Martin Luther, angry at corruption within the Catholic Church, sparked the Protestant Reformation in 1517. Though eventually excommunicated, his influence reshaped Christianity, and in 1526 he made a controversial addition. Exorcism became part of Protestant baptismal rites. In this form, it wasn't meant to remove a demon already present, but to symbolically protect infants from sin and the devil throughout their lives. Not all Protestant groups accepted the practice, but for a time, exorcism became a public and often theatrical affair. In Renaissance-era England, entire communities would gather for exorcisms, some performed by clergy, others by so-called professional exorcists. Many were later exposed as frauds, but the damage, or the fascination, was already done. Exorcism entered literature, referenced by writers like William Shakespeare, and even as skepticism grew, the imagery endured. By the early 1600s, most Protestant denominations abandoned the ritual, but its cultural shadow remained. Then, centuries later, it returned. In the early 1900s, evangelical movements reignited belief in the supernatural. Pentecostalism emerged, emphasizing the Holy Spirit and extraordinary gifts, speaking in tongues, faith healing, and exorcism. Unlike the quiet rituals of the past, these were loud, emotional, chaotic. Though the Catholic Church never abandoned exorcism, it was Pentecostal and evangelical movements that brought it back into public view. Their rapid growth throughout the early 20th century ensured exorcism would not stay buried in history. By the 1960s and 1970s, interest surged again. Charismatic Christianity, blending traditional denominations with Pentecostal practices, spread rapidly. Exorcisms were once more performed openly in the United States, Africa, and Latin America, and once again, culture followed belief. In 1971, a novel based on a real exorcism case involving a 14-year-old boy reignited global fear. When its film adaptation released in 1973, exorcism was no longer just a religious ritual. It was a nightmare. The timing was perfect and unsettling. Cinema was becoming darker, religion was in transition, and audiences were suddenly forced to confront a terrifying question. What if possession wasn't fiction? What if the rituals were real? And what if they still are? Because exorcism has never truly vanished. It has only waited. The true exorcism that inspired the Exorcist. They didn't call him by his real name at first, not in the records, not in the reports, and certainly not in public. For decades he was known only as Roland Doe, a name meant to protect him, and perhaps to protect everyone else. But behind that name was a very real boy, and at the time was 14 years old, living in the shadows of suburban Washington, D.C. And in 1949, something followed him home. It began quietly. Shortly after the death of his beloved Aunt Harriet, the boy, Ronald Edwin Hunkeler, began hearing sounds at night, scratching, knocking and rhythmic tapping behind the walls of his bedroom. At first, his family dismissed it as being old pipes, settling wood, or imagination. But the sounds didn't stop, and water began dripping from places it shouldn't. The floors trembled, and then his bed started to move. Not shake, but move. During the day, Ronald was calm, polite, normal. But when night fell, something changed. He would slip into trance-like states. His body would stiffen, his voice would drop, guttural, strained, not his own. Red scratches began appearing on his skin. They were lines, symbols, and words. No one ever saw them form. Doctors were consulted, psychiatrists, specialists. Nothing explained what was happening. Eventually, the family's Lutheran minister admitted defeat and quietly suggested something else. The Jesuits. In February of 1949, permission was granted for an exorcism. Father E. Albert Hughes was the first to attempt it. Ronald was strapped to his bed as prayers were recited. Latin filled the room, and then it turned violent. The boy tore a spring from the mattress and slashed the priest across the shoulders. The ritual was abandoned. Whatever was there was not finished. Over the following weeks, the activity escalated. Furniture slid across floors. Chairs moved on their own. A picture of Christ shook violently whenever Ronald entered the room. Witnesses watched in silence as scratches appeared on his body, beating out a rhythm like marching soldiers. Relics were thrown without being touched. Safety pins opened themselves, and then came the writing. The word Louis carved itself into his ribs, and Saturday appeared on his hip and across his chest, 3.5 weeks. No hands moved, no explanation followed. The message was clear, and Ronald was taken to St. Louis. There, Father William Bowden and Father Walter Halloran began a series of exorcisms that would stretch across 3 months, night after night, always the same pattern. Calm during the day and chaos after dark. Screaming, cursing, Latin phrases spoken by a boy who had never studied them. Objects flew through the air. Sacred items provoked violent reactions, and the markings continued. An X appeared on his chest, then another. The priests believed it signified 10 demons. A pitchfork-shaped wound snaked from his thigh to his ankle, as if something was moving beneath the skin. On March 21st, 1949, Ronald was admitted to Alexian Brothers Hospital. There, the exorcism reached its breaking point. He screamed, urinated the bed, and threatened the priests, but they didn't stop. On April 18th, the Monday after Easter, Ronald awoke in violent seizures. He screamed that the devil would always be with him. At 10:45 p.m., the priests invoked St. Michael the Archangel. And then, silence. Ronald collapsed. When he woke, he was calm, for the first time in months. The activity had ended. Catholic sources later reported that he had been freed from possession. The room at Alexian Brothers Hospital was sealed shut. The building itself would later be demolished. The house in Maryland was abandoned and eventually torn down. Ronald grew up, became a NASA engineer. He worked on the Apollo missions and helped design heat-resistant technology for space travel. But he never escaped the fear. On Halloween, he left his home every year, terrified someone would discover who he really was. He named his first son Michael, and shortly before his death, a priest arrived unannounced to perform last rites. No one knows how he knew. Ronald Edwin Hunkeler died in peace, but the story he left behind changed everything. It inspired The Exorcist and redefined possession in popular culture. It forced the world to confront a terrifying question. What if some stories are true? The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel. A true story that inspired The Exorcism of Emily Rose. There are some stories so disturbing, so deeply unsettling, that even decades later they refuse to stay buried. This is one of them. Long before Hollywood dramatized it, before courtrooms debated belief versus medicine, and before her name became synonymous with possession, there was a young woman named Anneliese Michel, and her suffering was real. Born on September 21st, 1952 in Bavaria, West Germany, Anneliese was raised in a devout Catholic household by her parents, Joseph and Anna Michel. Faith was not simply part of their lives, it was the foundation. Mass was attended twice a week. Sin was feared. Salvation was earned through suffering. From the outside, the Michel family appeared ordinary, but inside the home, something darker lingered. Years before Anneliese was born, her mother had given birth to an illegitimate child, an event that brought deep shame in their religious community. Anna Michel wore a black veil on her wedding day as a symbol of penance. And as Anneliese grew older, she was quietly taught that she, too, must help atone for this sin. Anneliese was described as sensitive, gentle, deeply empathetic. A child who felt the weight of guilt, even when it wasn't hers to carry. When her half-sister Martha died at just 8 years old following a failed kidney surgery, that burden only grew heavier. Anneliese began sleeping on a bare stone floor. She denied herself comfort. She prayed obsessively, not for herself, but for others she believed were damned. She was still just a child. Then, at 16 years old, everything changed. While at school, Anneliese suddenly blacked out. She wandered the halls in a daze, unresponsive. Soon after came violent convulsions, her body locking, shaking, betraying her. Doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy. Medication was prescribed, but it didn't help. The seizures continued. The blackouts worsened, and something else began to creep in. Trance-like states, hallucinations, and a growing suffocating fear that what was happening to her was not medical at all. Anneliese began to believe she was possessed, and chillingly, her family agreed. Temporal lobe epilepsy is known to cause hyperreligiosity, an intense, overwhelming fixation on faith. In Anneliese's case, her lifelong fear of damnation twisted inward. She began hearing voices while praying, voices that told her she was cursed, that she would rot in hell. She said she could see the devil. Medicine, she believed, was useless. Only God could save her now. As her condition deteriorated, her behavior became increasingly disturbing. She performed hundreds of squats a day, sometimes over 400, until her legs gave out. She crawled on all fours, barking like an animal. She consumed spiders, coal. She licked her own urine from the floor. On one occasion, she bit the head off a dead bird. Her mother later said that when this happened, it was something unnatural, something you can't explain. Most priests refused to help. They urged medical treatment. But Anneliese was convinced this was demonic possession. In 1975, when her depression deepened and suicidal thoughts crept in, a priest named Ernst Alt finally agreed to intervene. He petitioned the local bishop, Josef Stangl. Permission was granted, on one condition: the exorcism must remain secret. Another priest, Arnold Renz, was assigned. Over the next 10 months, Anneliese endured 67 exorcisms. Each session lasted up to 4 hours. She was restrained, forced to kneel, praying until her knees shattered, bones broken, tendons torn. She claimed 6 demons inhabited her body: Lucifer, Cain, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Adolf Hitler, and a disgraced priest known as Father Fleischmann. According to Anneliese, they fought over control of her body. The priests recorded over 42 hours of audio. On tape, her voice changes. She screams obscenities. She growls and speaks in tongues. She says she must die to atone for the sins of wayward youth and for fallen priests of the modern church. By the summer of 1976, Anneliese had stopped eating entirely. She weighed 66 pounds. Her body was skeletal. Her immune system collapsed. She developed pneumonia. Still, the exorcisms continued. On July 1st, 1976, at just 23 years old, Anneliese Michel died in her family's home in Klingenberg. The official cause: malnutrition and dehydration. The aftermath was explosive. Germany's media descended on the case. Doctors testified that she was not possessed, only gravely ill. That epilepsy and mental illness, worsened by extreme religious pressure, had been allowed to run unchecked. In 1978, Anneliese's parents and both priests stood trial for negligent homicide. The defense claimed there was no other option. The prosecution argued that medical intervention could have saved her life. The jury agreed with the prosecution. The priests were convicted of manslaughter by negligence, sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended, and 3 years of probation. Anneliese's parents were also found guilty, but were spared punishment, as the court determined they had suffered enough. The Catholic Church later recanted its stance, stating that Anneliese had not been possessed. Yet even now, pilgrims visit her grave. Some believe she was a martyr, a willing sacrifice. Her mother never wavered. "There was no other way," she said. For others, Anneliese Michel's story is something far more chilling, a warning about what happens when fear outweighs reason, when belief replaces treatment, and when suffering is mistaken for salvation. Because whether demons were real or not, Anneliese Michel was, and her nightmare was terrifyingly human. The sealed room. I didn't grow up believing in demons, at least not the way I do now. When I was younger, my family was close with a woman I'll call Marianne. She was practically family, best friends with my older sister, and technically related through marriage. Her upbringing was deeply religious, but like many people raised around constant faith, she'd grown distant from it as she got older. Marianne married young. Too young. A rushed marriage brought on by pregnancy to a man named Evan, someone quiet, withdrawn, and shaped by a household that never felt right. His father was rarely home, always working overnight shifts. His mother, Clara, was a ghost long before anyone realized she was haunted. She never attended events, never had friends, never left the house unless she absolutely had to. And when she did, she moved like someone expecting something terrible to happen. There was no religion in their home, no prayers, no protections. And Evan admitted, quietly, reluctantly, that when he was a teenager, he'd experimented with things he didn't understand. Candles, symbols, calling out to something in the dark of his bedroom. He stopped when it scared him, but not before something answered. After the wedding, Marianne and Evan moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment, desperate to escape his parents' house. Things were strained but manageable, until Clara suddenly insisted on moving in to help with the baby. She slept on the couch. Weeks turned into months. Marianne finally reached her breaking point. She told Evan the truth, that his mother's behavior wasn't normal, that Clara had spent decades refusing to sleep without her husband, staying awake all night just to match his schedule, sometimes even sleeping in her car outside his workplace rather than be alone. And yet now, suddenly, she couldn't return home. When Evan finally told his mother she had to leave, Clara collapsed. She sobbed. She begged. She told him, through broken gasps, that sending her back would kill her, that she wouldn't survive the night. That was when the other detail came out. When Evan moved out of his childhood home, Clara had done something no one understood. She took scrap wood and sealed his bedroom shut, the door at the end of the hall, the window outside, boarded over, as if locking something inside. The next morning over coffee, Clara finally confessed the truth to Marianne. Something was coming for her at night, something that touched her, pressed down on her chest, whispered, hurt her, something that followed her back to that room. Terrified and unsure what to do, Marianne reached out to her father, who told her only one thing: "You need to talk to a priest." They met with one, and shockingly, he didn't hesitate. He scheduled a house exorcism immediately. On the day it happened, several members of the parish were there, calm, grounded people I trusted. No dramatics, no hysteria. Everything felt normal until they reached the hallway. The priest led the group toward the sealed bedroom, and that's when Marianne felt it, a sudden pressure, like something running past her, fast, violent, displacing the air as it fled the room. At that exact moment, one of the women behind her screamed. She said something had struck her. When they brought her into the light and shined a flashlight on her arm, there was a handprint burned into her skin, red, angry, not human. The fingers were too long. The priest finished the exorcism, and just like that, the attacks stopped. Clara could sleep again. The room was unsealed. Life went on. I know how this sounds, but I know every person in this story, and some doors, once opened, never truly close. My encounter with something that followed me. I want to be very clear about something before I tell you this story. I was never possessed, but for several months, something noticed me, and once it did, it didn't let go easily. This happened years ago, long enough that I've had time to question it, rationalize it, and even try to forget it. But no matter how much distance I put between myself and that time, the memories never fade. They only wait. Back then, I was involved with a philosophical group I believed was about self-improvement and spiritual awareness. It met quietly, spoke in abstractions, and encouraged detachment from emotion, morality, even faith. At first, it felt harmless, enlightening even, but the deeper I went, the more wrong it felt, and the moment I realized that, truly realized it, I left. That's when the attacks began. At first it was physical, a burning sensation along the left side of my body, sharp, localized and persistent. It didn't feel like illness, it felt intentional, like pressure applied from the inside. Then came the nausea, a deep, sick twisting in my stomach that only happened when I prayed, when I went to church, when I tried to say words of faith out loud. The reaction was immediate, violent, as if something inside me recoiled. Sleep stopped being safe. One night, as I sat at my desk working late, something moved beneath it. I saw it clearly, too clearly, a low, muscular shape launching toward me, like a feral animal, claws, teeth, pure aggression, and then it was gone. No sound, no trace, just my heart hammering and my hands shaking. I told myself it was stress, hallucination, exhaustion, but then the technology started responding. My computer, brand new, clean system, displayed a message I had never typed, never searched, never seen before. 2 words. The dragon's assistant. Once. Never again. The television followed. Obscene phrases flashing for seconds at a time. Distorted images layered over regular programming. I unplugged it. It still happened. And then came the night I truly believed I was going to die. I was lying in bed, completely awake, when my heart stalled. Not stopped, but interrupted. As if something pressed against it from the inside, like a finger placed deliberately between beats. 1, pause, 2. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I waited, absolutely convinced the next beat wouldn't come. When it did, I sobbed until morning. That's when I reached out for help. Through a private referral, I contacted a priest connected to the local archdiocese. Young, calm, measured. He didn't dismiss me, didn't dramatize it. He listened, and when I finished, he told me something I wasn't expecting. He believed me. He said what I was experiencing was external oppression, not possession. That whatever had attached itself to that group hadn't followed me by accident, but because I had walked away. He met with me several times, prayed with me, had me forgive everyone involved, out loud, fully, completely, and slowly. The attacks stopped. No dramatic ending, no final confrontation, just silence. But even now, years later, I still carry his contact information in my wallet, because once something has found you, you never really forget what it felt like to be seen. The story ends here, but the terror does not. Join me again, like, comment, and subscribe if you dare.